Lecture number 5, Isaiah's Nations. Welcome back to Lecture 5 of our series of 6 lectures on Isaiah. Regarding the horizontal, I already hinted with the assessment at the parallel endings of 2 sections on judgment. I break it in 2 halves. Chapter 13 to 27 I entitled Oracles Concerning Nations. Chapter 28 to 35 I entitled Warnings. Both sections end with an apocalyptic description of judgment of the world, followed with restoration. Chapter 24 and 25, and then also in chapter 34. And a worship song, chapter 26 and 27, and chapter 35. I've also asked you to list the nations that are being judged. The first half, again called Oracles Concerning Nations, is in 13 verse 1 Babylon, 14:24 Assyria, 14:28 Philistia, 15 verse 1 Moab, 17:1 Aram, 17:4 Jacob, 18:1 Ethiopia, 19:1 Egypt. Obviously, the nations that only have a few verses can be combined into one vertical chart. Chapter 20 interrupts the flow, and we have a short historical narrative about Isaiah's call to Egypt and Ethiopia. Then the oracle picks up again in 21:1. The first one is the wilderness of the sea, which is Babylon. Then in 21:11 it mentions Duma, which is Edom. 21:13, the desert plain, is a reference to the Arabian region. 22:1, the valley of vision, is about Judah. In 22:15 begins an oracle against Shebna, not a nation or a region, but a person. He is the steward in charge of the king's household. In 23 verse 1 we have Tyre. This is a powerful city like Singapore is today. Then we close the oracles against foreign nations with the earth being judged and restored in 24:1 and a song of victory in 26:1. The second half, which I entitled Warnings, are woes against the garland, which is Israel, chapter 28, and Ariel, which is Jerusalem, chapter 29. Chapter 30 to 31 comes against trusting Egypt. Chapter 32 is a restoration passage. Chapter 33 is on judgment. Then we close this section with the nations being judged and restored in chapter 34, and the song of the ransomed in chapter 35. Can we find Satan in chapter 14? The basic outline, chapter 13, verses 1 to 22, is an oracle against Babylon, fulfilled by the Persians and Medes overthrowing Babylon in 539 BC. Chapter 14, verses 1 and 2, is a salvation oracle for Israel who will possess nations, and I believe it's fulfilled in the church age. Chapter 14 verses 3 to 23 is a taunt against the king of Babylon, not about Satan. Let's read Isaiah 14 verses 12 to 17. Isaiah 14 verses 12 to 17. How you are fallen from heaven, O day star, son of dawn! How you are cut down to the ground, you who laid the nations low! You said in your heart, I will ascend to heaven. I will raise my throne above the stars of God. I will sit on the mount of assembly on the heights of Zaphon. I will ascend to the tops of the clouds. I will make myself like the Most High. But you are brought down to Sheol, to the depths of the pit. Those who see you will stare at you and ponder over you. Is this the man who made the earth tremble, who shook kingdoms, who made the world like a desert and overthrew its cities, who would not let his prisoners go home? Note the repetition in verses 13 and 14 of the words, I will. You will find it 5 times. 5 times, I will. Have you ever heard this is Satan that is talked about in chapter 14? This started already about 160 AD by the church father Tertullian and became popular because everyone wants to know the answers to questions such as, why is there evil on earth? Where does it come from? once you're told that Satan was a created angel, an angel that later sinned and was cast down on earth, and then you start reading Isaiah 14, you are already told that this is about Satan, then then it seems to make sense. The King James Version keeps the Latin name for day star, which is Lucifer, in chapter 14, verse 12. So that is how the name Lucifer began to associate with Satan. It means shining one, or morning star. It has the meaning of brightness built in, like Jesus being the bright morning star in Revelation 22, verse 16. But would the OR understand this to mean Satan? There is very little said about Satan in the Old Testament. Apparently, it was not that important. In Genesis 3, verses 1 to 4, the serpent in the Garden of Eden can be identified in Revelation 12 as Satan who deceived Eve. In 1 Chronicles 21, verses 1 to 6, Satan incited David to take a census. In Job 1, verse 6 to 12, Satan accused righteous Job in front of God. In Zechariah chapter 3, verses 1 to 5, Satan accused the high priest wearing dirty clothes in Zechariah's vision. That is all we can find about Satan in the Old Testament. Now, is Isaiah 14 about Satan too? The context leaves no doubt that this is about Babylon. The author simply says so in 13 verse 1 and 14 verse 4. Babylonian kings thought of themselves as divine, and what is described is the pride and self-reliance of Babylon, which is a theme throughout the oracles against the nations and throughout the book of Isaiah. God is not blaming just Judah for trusting in anything else but God, which is pride. He also blames the nations for trusting in oneself and not in God. So in chapter 14 it makes perfect sense that God is coming against Babylon because they are so proud. They think they do not need anyone else. Turn for a moment to chapter 47. This chapter specifically talks about Babylon, and no one says that this is about Satan. In chapter 47, verses 8 to 13, it says, "Now therefore hear this, you lover of pleasures, who sit securely, who say in your heart, I am, and there is no one besides me. I shall not sit as a widow or know the loss of children. Both these things shall come upon you in a moment, in one day. The loss of children and widowhood shall come upon you in full measure. In spite of your many sorceries and the great power of your enchantments, you felt secure in your wickedness. You said, no one sees me. Your wisdom and your knowledge led you astray, and you said in your heart, I am, and there is no one besides me. But evil shall come upon you, which you cannot charm away. Disaster shall fall upon you, which you will not be able to ward off. And ruin shall come on you suddenly, of which you know nothing. Stand fast in your enchantments, and your many sorceries, with which you have labored from your youth. Perhaps you may be able to succeed, perhaps you may inspire terror. You are wearied with many consultations. Let those who study the heavens stand up and save you. Those who gaze at the stars and at each new moon predict what shall befall you. Now, note the repetition. You said in your heart, I am, and there is no one besides me. You see that in at least 2 times, right, in the passage that I read for you. Now, the immediate context in chapter 37 is that Babylon was used by God to punish Israel, much like Assyria was his rod of anger against Israel. But Babylon became proud and thinks of himself to be divine. It thinks it is God. Now go back to chapter 14, and Babylon is quoted as having said, I will ascend to the tops of the clouds. I will make myself like the Most High. For this Babylon is judged. And God mocks Babylon's religion and astrology in 47 verses 12 to 13. And again, go back to Isaiah 14. Isaiah was not talking about Satan, but about Babylon and its practices in astrology. Babylon in the New Testament becomes a symbol for that what is in opposition to God. They are the ones who destroyed Jerusalem and, more importantly, the temple. They are the ones who exiled Judah and, more importantly, the Davidic throne. Babylon's opposition to God started all the way back in Genesis 10, when Nimrod was the first to build a kingdom and the Tower of Babel, a ziggurat that symbolizes a mountain with a temple on the top, which together bridges the gap that separates humanity from the gods, and zodiac priests ministered in these shrines, and they are the ones who developed astrology. Even back in Genesis, the people of ancient Babylon wanted to rise above the stars of God. It is because of its history Babylon became a symbol of what opposes God's rule, of that what opposes God's rule. But that doesn't mean there is another history to be read into the text, and so there is a dual meaning. Why look for a dual meaning? And why only here and not elsewhere in the text? We have to be careful not to take too much liberty in our interpretations and find new meanings the author never intended. Do you think the original reader would have said to themselves, "Oh yeah, I understand, Isaiah is talking about Satan now"? Of course not. Oracles concerning nations. The first nation addressed was Babylon, chapter 13 verse 1 through 14 verse 23. What comes after this is an oracle spoken over Assyria. "I will break the Assyrian in my land. His yoke shall be removed," chapter 14 verse 24 to 27. This is about the fall of Nineveh, fulfilled in 612 BC. After that we have a brief oracle spoken against the Philistines, chapter 14 verse 28 to 31, and it was uttered in the year King Ahaz died, which is in 715 BC. The Philistines were a sea people, believed to have come from the island Crete and settled in Palestine around 1200 to 1000 BC. The first who had a struggle with them was Samson in Judges 14 verse 4. Saul was killed in battle against them, 1 Samuel 31. They were finally subdued by David, 2 Samuel 8 verse 1. More information you can read from the handout. What I would like to point out, though, is the salvation oracle in chapter 14 verse 32. Isaiah promises the Philistines a place of refuge in Zion. The next oracle is against Moab, chapter 15 verse 1 through 16 verse 14. The Moabites are the offspring of Lot's incestual relationship with his daughters, who also settled in the Transjordan region. Their first contact with Israel was when its king sent Balaam to curse Israel. You read that in the book of Numbers. Ruth was a Moabite. The Moabites functioned like mercenaries for Nebuchadnezzar against Judah. Many Jews fled to Moab in 586 BC for refuge. They were judged for their pride, 16 verse 6, for the bloodshed they caused, 15 verse 9, and for their idolatry, 16 verse 12. Isaiah was not happy making these predictions, but did it with tears in his eyes. You see that in chapter 15 verse 5 and 16 verses 9 to 11. Like with Philistia, like with the Philistines, now again a salvation oracle follows after the judgment for Moab. To them also is justice and refuge offered with the coming of the Messiah. The next oracle is spoken against Damascus, the capital of Syria, for Syria, not Assyria, but Syria, that's Aram. Chapter 17, verses 1 to 3. After Israel became a nation under David, the cities and tribes in the north also came together under King Rezon, or Hezion, Hezion, and this happened around 940 BC. They were a common enemy of both Israel and Judah. Damascus fell in 732 BC to the Assyrians. Then we have an oracle against Jacob, which is a metonymy for Israel here. In chapter 17, verses 4 to 14. Israel is the nation that had turned their back on God and set up the golden calves, in chapter 17, verse 10. They allied with Assyria to come against Judah, and though its capital Samaria did not fall at the same time Damascus fell, the Assyrian did come in to plunder, and this was likened with a harvest of the land, leaving Israel only the gleanings, chapter 17, verse 6. And a salvation oracle follows in chapter 17, verse 7 and 8, and again fulfilled in Jesus, a spiritual fulfillment. After that, we have oracles spoken against Ethiopia and Egypt, chapter 18, verse 1 through 20, verse 6. Israel and Judah formed the perfect buffer zone for Egypt to keep enemies like Assyria and Babylon out as long as possible, so they would make an alliance with Israel. But they never honored them. They never would come to help when Israel or Judah came under siege by these enemies that they had in common. For that they were judged. Chapter 20, verse 6. First we read judgment against Ethiopia, and as usual a salvation oracle followed in 18, verse 7. Gifts from Ethiopia will come to Jerusalem, and this prediction finds its fulfillment perhaps in the fact that the first Gentile convert was an Ethiopian. You see that in Acts chapter 8, verse 28. Then Egypt's judgment is addressed in 19 verses 1 to 17, followed with salvation for them in chapter 19 verse 18 to 24. One Egyptian city is singled out, and that is the city On, O-N. In Greek that is Heliopolis, that is Heliopolis, which was the principal place for the worship of Ra, the sun god. That place will turn into a city worshipping Jehovah. The theme of highway we find also elsewhere in Isaiah is here. In this case a highway between Assyria and Egypt, two enemies of God and with each other, and yet both become fellow worshippers of God. Obviously this can only be fulfilled in a spiritual sense, and pictures both the inclusion of and unity between the Gentile nations in the new kingdom. After the intermission of chapter 20 about Isaiah's call to Egypt, we continue with the oracle and have another one concerning Babylon, the wilderness of the sea, and this is found in 21 verses 1 to 10. At the end of Revelation, when we have the new heaven and earth, there are 7 no mores. Death will be no more, pain will be no more, night will be no more, etc. Now one of them is the sea. The sea will be no more. You see that in Revelation chapter 21 verse 1. To the average Jew, the sea is a hostile place where the sea monsters live, in Isaiah 27 verse 1. And now, in Revelation where it says, fallen, fallen is Babylon, we also see that in Isaiah 21 verse 9. Fallen, fallen is Babylon. This is announced by the watchman from the watchtower of a city. And so John picked up on that in Revelation, and we see that in Revelation chapter 14 verse 8 and 18 verse 2, where Babylon symbolizes the evil world government and whose judgment is announced by angels. Note there is no salvation oracle following. This doesn't mean there will be no Babylonians in heaven. Whenever a prediction is fulfilled in the church age or age to come, the prediction is fulfilled in a spiritual sense or symbolic sense. And as already discussed, Babylon symbolically represents the enemy that opposes God. The next oracle is against Duma, which is a city in Edom, in chapter 21, verses 11 and 12. Isaiah is judging Edom, but says Duma, which means silence, a wordplay to indicate that silence is a result of their defeat. The Edomites are descendants of Esau, You see that in Genesis 25 verse 30, who also settled in the Transjordan area. They refused Moses and Israel a passage when they were on the way to the promised land. Then we see that Saul defeated them in battle, and that's in 1 Samuel 14 verses 47. David went one step further and occupied their territory. You see that in 2 Samuel 8 verse 14. Though defeated in battles, they remained independent. 2 Kings 8 verse 20 and 22. Until they were forced to become a vassal of Assyria and held Babylon in their siege of Jerusalem. What followed after this is an oracle against the desert plain, which is about the Arabian region, 21 verses 13 to 16. Arabian warriors traveling in groups on camels in the desert is what is described here. Next is an oracle concerning the Valley of Vision in chapter 22 verses 1 to 14. And it's about Judah. You can see that in chapter 22 verse 8. Why is this placed along with the foreign nations? Perhaps to tell Judah that they are no better than those nations. They think they are stronger than their neighbor nations, but God has removed his protection. 22 verse 8. The word that follows in chapter 22 verse 15 to 25 is against Shebna, the steward and head of the king's household. He is a disgrace to the royal house. You see that in 22 verse 18. Possibly because he was instrumental in Ahaz's decision to make an alliance with Assyria. The judgment against him is that Eliakim will take his place, and apparently it did, as in 2 Kings 18 verse 18, Eliakim had become in charge of the palace. The oracle that follows concerns Tyre, chapter 23 verses 1 to 18. This is one of the two cities in Phoenicia, Tyre and Sidon, which is mentioned in 23 verse 12, were both famous seaport cities, of which eventually Tyre became the most powerful. They controlled the Mediterranean sea trade. Their wealth, sea power, and geographic location saved them from Assyrian dominance. Yet judgment came hard on them, and eventually there will be a harbor no more, it says in 23 verse 10. When is this fulfilled? Three options. Nebuchadnezzar of Babylon laid a 13-year siege, only destroying the old Tyre, which is mainland city. Alexander the Great of Greece destroyed the new Tyre, the island city, in 332 BC. Then later we see that Muslim Arabs destroyed the city in 1219 AD, after which it never was rebuilt again. The salvation oracle that follows in chapter 23 verses 15 to 18 makes mention of a song about a forgotten prostitute. Or the original reader knew the song, so would have understood Isaiah. For us, it's a little harder to understand, but it's something about money and wealth that so often was used to advance the kingdom of darkness and is now used in the kingdom of God. Perhaps fulfilled collectively by all the offerings given to advance the kingdom of God in the church and in missions. This is the end of the series of judgments and restorations concerning nations, and we now read about the final judgment and restoration of the earth. That's in chapter 24 and 25. God's final victory is celebrated in a song in chapter 26 and chapter 27. After that we come to the second half of oracles, and this half contains 6 woes. Chapter 28 verse 1, 29 1, and also 29 15, chapter 30 verse 1, 31 1, and 33 verse 1. The first woe is against the garland, which is Israel. Chapter 28 verses 1 to 13. The reason of judgment is because the elite lived in luxury. You see that in verse 1 of 28. Because of its pride, 28 verses 3 and 4, and failure of the priests and prophets, 28 verses 7 and 8. The people behaved like drunkards, not understanding Isaiah's full message, so God has to resort to baby talk, chapter 28, verse 9. Speak like them. Speak only a little at a time. Precept upon precept, line upon line, here a little, there a little. We see that in chapter 28, verse 10. Though coined to be a slogan for a well-known Bible study, this verse is not meant positively. Like a drunkard stammering and with alien tongue, chapter 28, verse 11. A salvation oracle follows in 28 verses 14 to 18. And Isaiah uses metaphors of a stone, like he did previously in chapter 8 verse 14. Both Peter, in 1 Peter 2 verse 6, and Paul, in Romans 9:33, pick up on that. To those who believe on Christ, he is a foundation stone, a tested stone, a precious cornerstone, a sure foundation. Chapter 28, verse 16. But to those who reject him, he becomes a stumbling block, a rock one stumbles over in chapter 8, verse 14. God at times is compared with a stone or a rock, such as in Psalm 18, verse 2, a durable item which makes a good foundation. It is a metaphor for God that also developed into a messianic title in Genesis 49 verse 24, in Psalm 118 verse 22, and here in Isaiah 28 verse 16. But it's also a place of judgment, like we saw in Isaiah 8 verse 14. Now, Peter quoted Psalm 118 verse 22 in Acts 4:11 in his speech to the Sanhedrin. You are those very builders who have rejected the stone, and that stone has become the cornerstone. A cornerstone of what? Of a building. So the early church pictured and developed a new metaphor, and that is of a building. Now a building is something that has walls made of stones and a cornerstone. A cornerstone is placed at the corner, which helps the builder to properly align the walls of the building. To build a house, you need an architect. God is the architect and says, I'm building a house. The house is built by builders. The builders ought to build according to the blueprint that was given to them, the plan of God, the building that God had in mind. Now the building was Israel and Judaism. A building is made out of stones. The stones are the people. The building was built by builders. The builders were the leaders in Israel. They were responsible to build according to the blueprint. Now the problem was that the builders decided to build their own building, not according to the blueprint. So when God sent the most important stone, the cornerstone didn't fit. And it was rejected. Jesus was rejected. They rejected Jesus by crucifying him. Now, Jesus rose from the dead, and this was the beginning of a new building, a new temple. John chapter 2, verses 19 and 20. God did not reject the cornerstone and began a new building with it, which is the church, in Acts 4 verse 11, 1 Peter 2 verse 7. So the stone became the cornerstone for a new building. While the leaders of Israel continued working on their building, God began building a whole new building, of which Jesus became the cornerstone. Chapter 29 has a woe oracle against Ariel. This word is believed to have come from the word Ara, meaning the fire hearth or altar. So it's a reference to the altar of God, the place of worship for the people of God. But here the prophet speaks in distress because of the hypocrisy in Judah's worship. See 29 verse 13. Jesus quotes from it the words, "Their hearts are far from me. when speaking of the Pharisees and their hypocrisy. You can see that in Matthew 15 verses 8 and 9 and Mark 7 verse 6 and 7. Again, a salvation oracle follows in chapter 29 verses 17 to 24. The deaf shall hear, the blind will see. These are signs of the Messiah, according to Matthew 11 verse 5. In chapter 30 to 31, there is a warning against trusting Egypt. Instead, the teacher will take care of you, and him you shall trust. Verses 19 to 26 of chapter 13. He will lead you, in verse 21. He will purge you from all idolatry, in verse 22. He will make you prosper, verses 23 to 24. He will bring you light, verses 26. He will bring you healing, verses 26. Jesus fulfilled the role of a teacher in John chapter 13, verse 13. The final woe is against the destroyer in chapter 33, which is Assyria. This is the end of the series of warnings, and now we read about the final judgment and restoration of the earth. And that, of course, is the nations that are within the earth in chapter 34. Note again the parallel ending with the oracle concerning nations section. God vindicates his people in a cosmic battle which plays out like a sacrifice on the altar. The host of heaven rot away, chapter 34 verse 4, is about Satan's defeat. The skies roll up like a scroll, chapter 34 verse 4, sounds like Revelation 6 verses 12 to 14, and will happen at the second coming when Jesus brings the final judgment. Edom, in chapter 34 verses 5 and 9, technically the descendants of Esau, Jacob's twin brother, but here used as a metonymy for God's enemy, representing the other child, not God's children, but that of the enemy. Bozrah, in chapter 34 verse 6, is a sheep herding center in Edom. Now we have come to the end of this lecture, and I would like you to finish charting chapter 13 to 35. You will need a handout on fulfillments to put that information into your charts. With this you have finished charting the first half of the book. Now read again chapter 40 to 66. This time do also the PTs for chapter 40 to 66. The first division I entitled The Purge of God. The second division is The Comfort of God. But of course you can come up with your own titles describing judgment and restoration. For the second division, remember the repeated phrase, "There is no peace, says the Lord, for the wicked." That concludes each section. So we come to 3 sections, each 9 chapters long. Chapter 40 to 48, chapter 49 to 57, and chapter 58 to 66. Now I want you to trace the word servant and servants in the plural in chapter 40 to 66. And color code it. Use a different color to indicate when the servant is meant the nation Israel, Jesus, or the church. Think of each of these sections what title to give. Finish your horizontal, and we will meet again when you're ready for lecture number 6.